Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to Sea Fever, North Norfolk's Festival of Poetry and Prose. This is the fourth such Sea Fever that we've celebrated. It's the very first that we've done online, and in future, such as the success of the online broadcast been, I'm sure we'll be doing it forever in this way, although of course in Sea Fever 5, which we celebrate next May, we hope that COVID will be over and that we will be inviting and welcoming large numbers of people to the wonderful festival that we have here at Maltings. It's a huge pleasure this evening to introduce Peter Willis, who's going to talk about one of my favourite Arthur Ransome books, The Big Six. Peter probably needs very little introduction. He's very well known in yachting circles. He was Classic Boats editor for 15 years. He still writes regularly for that and other yachting magazines. And perhaps most importantly, in this particular context, he is chairman of the Nancy Blackett Trust. As I'm sure many of you will know, Nancy Blackett was Arthur Ransome's perhaps most famous and delightful creation. She was also the name that he gave to a boat that he acquired in the 1930s, and he gave that boat originally with the most attractive mod name, I think something like Electron or Electra, the name of his favourite character, because his favourite character, of course, had permitted him to buy the boat. As I say, Peter is chairman of the Nancy Blackett Trust. Have a look at the Nancy Blackett Trust and its work, and have a sail, as I have done myself, on Nancy Blackett. And do please enjoy what Peter Willis has to say about this wonderful book. Finally, before Peter comes on, a couple of points. Firstly, we are here courtesy of the generosity of Wells Maltings, who is hosting the festival entirely on a pro bono basis. The festival itself is unpaid, and so too are the speakers. All this is practically possible only through their generosity, through the Maltings' generosity, and through the generosity too of our sponsors, the local solicitors, Hayes & Storr. Do enjoy Peter Willis.
At the beginning of 1940s, the Ransomes, Arthur and his Russian wife Evgenia, were settled into Harkstead Hall, about a couple of miles inland from their beloved Pin Mill in Suffolk, and importantly, on the right side of the River Orwell, unlike their previous home, Brook Farm at Levington on the north bank. The name perhaps exaggerates its size. In fact, Evgenia reportedly found the rooms a bit small, but it was a comfortable 4-square farmhouse. They'd moved in the previous April, and Ransome had divided the summer months between finishing Secret Water, which was published in November 1939, and sailing his new yacht, Selina King, until the wartime regulations had required her, like all private yachts, to be laid up at the end of September for the duration of the war. The Second World War impinged daily and nightly on their life in Suffolk. Harkstead Hall reverberated to the nightly air raids, to the dread distress of Evgenia particularly, and Arthur fulminated about the folly of evacuating London children to this particular part of the countryside until the policy was reversed and they were sent home or elsewhere. Ransome, though, had work to get on with. He needed to start in earnest on his next book, which would be the 9th in the series that had started with Swallows and Amazons, written in 1929, published in 1930. This was now his career. The Arthur Ransome books had become immensely popular, with a new one published nearly every Christmas. As a publishing phenomenon in children's literature, they probably remained unrivaled until the arrival of Harry Potter in the 1990s. Ransome was a careful and conscientious novelist whose books enjoyed both excellent sales and an enviable literary reputation. But he always worried about where the inspiration for the next one was going to come from. He'd been glad enough to escape the tyranny of journalistic deadlines, but plotting, writing, and illustrating a whole book to provide his publishers with a new Ransome book every October or November could be just as wearing. There were signs that he'd hoped to draw a line under the series with Secret Water, which brings the plot of Swallows and Amazons full circle. As in that book, they were exploring an uninhabited island, but this time they were approaching it not in a dinghy on a safe inland lake, but in the same tidal waters they just mastered in the Rite of Passage book We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea, and in the same boat, the Goblin. There's even a postcard sent to a young fan who wrote to thank him for Secret Water, which says, this is Ransome, "Thank you for your nice letter. I'm glad you liked the books. I'll have to see about what can be done about another, though it seems to me that 8 are about enough." But, even if he'd brought the tale of the Swallows at least to a satisfactory conclusion, there were still some loose ends to follow up, some other characters who still demanded further development. In particular, he'd been pleased with the Norfolk boat builders' sons, Joe, Bill and Pete, known as the Destined Glories after the ramshackle boat they'd sail, whom he'd created for Coot Club. In that book, published in 1934 and set on the Norfolk Broads in 1932, it was his first move away from the Lake District setting of Swallows and Amazons. We meet Tom Dudgeon, son of a local GP and leader of a group of youngsters dedicated to bird protection. He casts off a hired motor cruiser, the Margaretta, moored across a coot's nest where the eggs are about to hatch. The holiday group on the cruiser, an unpleasant bunch of hullabaloos, set out to catch and punish him, assisted by a local lad, George Howden, who sells eggs to collectors. In the end, they crash their cruiser and have to be rescued, and the boat salvaged by the Destined Glories. In this new book, The Big Six, set a few months later, boats keep getting cast adrift, under circumstances which always seem to implicate the Destined Glories. It appears someone wants them barred from the river. This is the basis for Ransome's venture into the world of detective fiction. The germ of the idea had been implanted 2 years earlier, back in the winter of 1937 to 38. In the October, soon after the completion of We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea, Arthur and Virginia took a week's holiday in a motor cruiser on the Norfolk Broads. At about that time, he somehow strained himself, suffering an umbilical hernia, which put him into hospital in Norwich for about 6 weeks. It was during this period of enforced idleness that he fully indulged his passion for detective stories. Soon after he got home, he wrote to his friend Margaret Reynolds, who appears to have suggested a detective theme for his next book. "Detective, why not?" replied Ransome. "Now then," he continued, "George Howden of Coot Club is obviously the right criminal, and he's off, plotting and planning. The detective work must be forced on them to clear themselves of some villainy which, thanks to George Howden, they are bearing the blame. What the devil can it be?" However, that's about as far as he'd got then, apart from a couple of set pieces, a nocturnal visit to the eelman up the river, with the subsequent attempt to smoke the eels and eat them, and the landing of a massive pike, followed by the visit to the Roaring Donkey pub to have it weighed, neither of which at that stage had any intrinsic link to any putative plot, and indeed they don't really have much link to the plot when it was finally put together. The new Broads book was set aside in favour of supervising the building of Selina King and writing up some set pieces towards a never realised book about that, and the writing of Secret Water. During the first half of 1939, however, he put himself on a crash course in the writing of detective stories by becoming the Observer's crime fiction reviewer. Every week between the 19th of February and the 16th of July, under the nom de plume of William Blunt, he provided the Sunday paper with a 1,000-word review covering 5 or 6, sometimes even more, different novels. It added up to 21 articles dealing with 123 detective fiction titles. The reviews covered whatever was published in that period. Most in fact, were by now unrecognised writers. Some of these seem from the reviews as if they might be worth following up, but they and their authors have generally faded into utter obscurity. A few, however, have stood the test of time, including Raymond Chandler, with whose colourful Americanisms Mr. Blunt engages some innocent fun. But it's the title of the book under review that arrests the attention. It's The Big Sleep. Could Ransome have been subliminally influenced to adapt it for his own forthcoming book? And it's also worth noting in passing that Agatha Christie, who was a close contemporary of Ransome's and whose work he greatly admired, wrote a book called The Big Four, published in 1927. These four are in fact villains, whereas Ransome's six are detectives, named after the Big Five of Scotland Yard. This name was newspaper shorthand for the detective chief superintendents in charge of the 4 London districts in the Metropolitan Police Force, plus their colleague in charge of HQCID Branch C1 in Scotland Yard. Anyway, back to the works of William Blunt. Ransome begins his first review by defining the rules of the game, which he considers akin to those of chess. No problem is of satisfying beauty if it deviates by a hair's breadth from certain rules. There must be only one possible solution. The pieces must not make moves other than those that they could make in the ordinary course of play, and no piece on the board may be an irrelevant idler. Those rules can be applied to detective stories as well as to chess problems, and a neglect of any one of them by the writer amounts to cheating the reader, he wrote. We'll see in a moment how well Ransome applies these strictures in The Big Six, but he is understandably obliged to duck another of his own requirements. Death is pretty nearly the only motive that in a detective story makes the reader feel that something is at stake to justify the hard brainwork that all those earnest folk put in while hunting for the criminal. No death, no detective story. In another review, he opens with the flat assertion, "A detective story without death is like a game of bridge played for love." So, has he snookered, or to revert to his own chosen metaphor, checkmated himself before he starts? A murder would be unthinkable in any children's story, and especially in a Ransome book. In fact, Ransome avoids crime altogether as a plot engine in his other books, except for the one incidental burglary in Swallows and Amazons. But he has already redefined the role of death in a plot, to suit his own purposes. It is, he says, a sufficient justification and pretty nearly the only one for the efforts of the detectives. And in that letter to Margaret Reynolds, he has already supplied an alternative sufficient impulse for the Destined Glories to clear their name of a false accusation, and one, moreover, which threatens their own ability to live their lives in the community and the surroundings which mean so much to them. It's noteworthy, incidentally, how Ransome manages to introduce the familiar Broadland scenes and suggest how the experience of being under suspicion has subtly changed the relationship of the boys with their favourite places, creating an impediment to their enjoyment of their homelands. "What if there ain't no Cook Club?" said Joe, suddenly gloomy again. "And if we get stopped off the river, who's to watch the nests? That George Howden will be selling bittens, eggs and warblers and beardies and no one to stop him." Being young and naive, they can't believe, firstly, that the boats haven't come adrift by accident. Then, once they acknowledge that it appears to be deliberate, that it is being done to implicate themselves. It takes an external intelligence to start joining up the dots. This is supplied by the arrival of Dick and Dot, or Dorothea. Who are they? Well, they are a couple of other favoured characters with whom Ransome feels he has unfinished business. He first introduced them in Winter Holiday. This is the third in the series, and set in the Lake District setting. Although unusually, the story starts not with the Swallows and Amazons themselves, but with two new characters, Dick and Dorothea Callum, arriving to stay at a farmhouse with Mrs. Dixon, parked there by their parents who have gone off on an archaeological dig. To begin with, they are lonely and rather bored, and envious of 6 other children they see with a boat, playing on an island. Those of us familiar with the earlier books recognise these as the Swallows and the Amazons, and one has to admire Ransome's ingenuity and sheer cheek actually in introducing them in this way. Eventually, of course, they all meet up, and it feels rather as if we, the readers, by this device, are ourselves at last being admitted to the charmed circle of the 4 Swallows and the 2 Amazons, which we too have so far gazed enviously upon. Their eventual meeting, brought about by Dick's signalling to their bedroom at Holly Howe from his observatory in an old barn, is classic Ransome. The 6 that they've been signalling to walk up through the snow to the observatory after some signalling for a pre-arranged meeting on neutral ground. "We saw you on the island yesterday," said Dorothea. "We saw you," said the smaller boy. The elder of the Redcaps, guess who, broke in impatiently. "Oh, here we are anyway," she said, "but what are you?" "Our name is Callum, he is Dick and I am Dorothea." "Oh, yes, said the Redcap. "Dick and Dorothea, but what are you? In real life, I mean. We're explorers and sailors." "Dick's an astronomer," said Dorothea promptly. "Dorothea writes stories," said Dick. And we learn a huge amount from this brief exchange. The newcomers get immediately what is meant by real life, and they automatically work together with each other in answering the question. Dick is a rather geeky 10 or 11-year-old who loves science, and Dorothea, his sister, is a couple of years older, and indeed she likes writing stories. They quickly gain acceptance and become part of the combined gang of S, A and D's, Swallows, Amazons and D's, appearing in 6 of the 12 books all told, while also providing a bridge between the Lakes titles and those set on the Broads. In fact, in Coop Club, the next book after Winter Holiday, they open the action again, sitting on a train about to leave Norwich for Wroxham, which is just pulling out when a boy hurls himself into the carriage. A common interest in birds is soon established, and later that afternoon they hide Tom, for it is he, from the hullabaloos just after he's cast off the Margaretta. They help him evade the hullabaloos, and he teaches them to sail. In fact, their role in Coot Club is chiefly to be intelligent and ignorant, observing the scenery and the action and enabling Ransome to teach them and us, the readers, what we need to know about how to sail. Dot, who has a livid imagination, or even a vivid imagination, and a fairly lurid literary style, begins putting Tom's adventures into a story titled The Outlaw of the Broads, which always, as far as I know, remains unfinished, but is forever supplying blank manuscript pages for making notes and writing down lists. Their entry onto the scene in the Big Six is promised early on. They are coming to stay with Mrs. Barrable again, though this time in a cottage, but Ransome withholds their arrival until chapter 11, by which time the evidence against the D&Gs has piled up, with numerous boats cast off. Ransome also introduces a neat red herring in the form of their unexplained wealth. They receive a reward for catching the record pike, but are sworn to keep quiet until it is unveiled in the pub. And a suspected source of this wealth, a quantity of shackles stolen from one of the boat builders. In other words, it's a very well-structured detective story, with the pressure on the innocent suspects continuing to increase as the detectives, now led by Dorothea, begin to get to grips with their investigation. The tide of suspicion, though, begins to turn in the boys' favour soon after the shackles incident is revealed. A little earlier than that, though, Dr. Dudgeon's faith in them is beginning to waver. Let's read a little bit of it too. "My goodness, Tom," said Dr. Dudgeon, "I used to think that coot club of yours was a very good thing, but I can't say I'm so sure about it today." "But they haven't done a single thing," said Tom indignantly. "Things keep happening where they are," said his father. "Suppose," said Dorothea, "someone else likes doing those things and always manages to do them when the coots are there to get the blame." Dr. Dudgeon looked at her gravely. "Potter Hiram's a long way from Horning," he said. "Well, nothing else is going to happen where they are," said Tom. "They'll be all right at Ranworth." "If anything were to happen there," said Dr. Dudgeon, puffing at his pipe, "I might begin to think there was something in Dorothea's brilliant theory, but I don't think anything will." But of course, something has already happened at Ranworth, where Dorothea has advised them to hide out, though the Dees and Tom and his parents don't know it yet. 6 or 7 boats are cast off overnight, and after they swiftly abandon their first thought, which is to round them up again, the Destined Glories have to make good their escape in the face of angry locals. It's when they meet Tom and the Dees in Titmouse, Tom's dinghy, on their way back, that the idea of becoming detectives arises. "Someone must be doing it on purpose," said Dorothea. "But everyone thinks it's the coots, so they aren't looking properly for anyone else." "It's getting pretty serious," said Tom. "What we want are detectives," said Dorothea. And a few moments later, she has her brainwave. "Why shouldn't we be detectives too?" Immediately the Destined Glories are sent off to hide their boat, while Tom and the Dees head for Ranworth, where they find their first clues, some bicycle tyre tracks and a connector tube from a tyre pump. And before the day is over, the shed in the Dudgeon's garden, the Coot Club headquarters, has been transformed, chiefly by Dorothea, into Scotland Yard. From then on, it's Dorothea running the show, evaluating clues, planning traps for the villain and peering into his mental processes. It's she who knows all about the Big Five and dubs her detective team the Big Six. Although the Dees have stepped up from being the novices they were in the Coot Club, and it is their intelligence that energises this investigation, there is a sense that they are still, to an extent, the outsiders they were when they first arrived in Coot Club, and as they were too when they first appeared in Winter Holiday. When Bill says, "You'd never think that Doc got such a head on her," and Pete adds, "And that Dick gets things taped, don't he?" There's not only an element of surprise as well as admiration in those statements, but also with "that Dart" and "that Dick" an implication of distance, both social and geographic. Those D's, visitors, not locals, are, despite their acceptance in Coot Club, still more foreigners than Coots, as well as being, like Tom himself, of a different social stratum to that of the boat builder's sons. It doesn't matter, but it is there, and Ransome is sensitive to it. Many of the D's triumphs in the various books in which they appear come from Dick and his scientific mind, but here it is Dot's novelistic imagination and her apparent passion for the same sort of detective stories Ransome likes. You can bet she reads Agatha Christie, that come to the fore. It is she who is well up in the conventions of the genre and who turns the Cook Club shed into Scotland Yard. As ever, though, they work as a team. It is Dorothea who outthinks the villain, but it's Dick and his camera, that provide the vital evidence. He brings the camera, with him when they arrive to stay with Mrs. Barrable. "What's that?" asked Pete. "Camera," said Dick, unslinging it. Where it comes from isn't explained. Possibly it's one his archaeological father had to spare, but it's clearly a good one. And Dick, being Dick, who wants to photograph birds and their nests, has taken trouble to learn how to operate it. "Progress 15 yards," said Dick aloud in the boat, getting his camera ready. "Exposure 115, stop 6.3. A camera is a defining thing for Dick to have, commented a contributor on one of the Ransome Facebook sites recently, and so it is. The climax of the book is the flash photograph he sets up for one of the Destined Glories to trigger, showing the villains pushing off a boat, and then his development of the film in Mrs. Barrable's bathroom, and the photograph he prints off to show the informal inquest at the end. So one question then is, what sort of camera did Dick have? There are no clues in the book, except the indications of its complexity, so it wasn't a cheap box brownie. It would most probably have been something like this. Now this is what we call a Bellows camera, and this particular one never opens to order, but we'll give it a try. Oh, there we are. There's the Bellows. It was pretty much a standard design at that time. It had been since about 1898. This one, a Voigtlander Besser, was made in 1929 and was typical of the type. The film used, black and white of course, was the universal 120 size, with 8 frames on a roll, producing images 6 by 9 centimetres, which is a little bit larger than a credit card. Development was relatively straightforward, providing Mrs. Barrable's bathroom could be properly blacked out. Evidently, Dick was using orthochromatic film, still quite common at the time. It's insensitive to red light, so as described in chapter 31, in the dark room, Dick can, with a red light on, safely remove the film from the camera, cut it up and put the piece he needs in an open tray of developer. The alternative type, panchromatic film, which would also have been available then, but not so widely used, does require complete darkness, and this would be familiar to people like some of you and to me, who can remember taking and developing black and white photos and using a changing bag to load the developing tank in a fully dark room and all that business. Luckily for Dick and for Ransome, who decides he has to describe the step-by-step process, he didn't have to bother with any of that and could work under the red light, using the chemicals and other bits of darkroom kit which he would have doubtless brought with him, Dick, that is to say, while Pete, who helped take the photo, watches. Another little bit from the book. The faint red light from the lamp seemed to be getting stronger every minute. Pete's eyes were getting accustomed to it. He had no difficulty with the hypocrystals and very little with adding the water, though he could not be sure he had put in enough without dipping the tip of a finger in to feel. "You got the boat all right," said Dick. "I do believe you did." His voice trembled. "Look out for that typo, don't bring it too near. One drop in the developer would spoil it. Put it down on the table. But see that? That big lump of black's the boat. It can't be anything else." But the catchalot's white, said Pete. Not in the negative, said Dick. Everything comes the other way round, and then it comes right again when you pint it. Look, that'll be trees on the other side of the river, and all that white's probably the black water. Pete peered into the dish at the film, but Dick did not dare to hold it still for more than a second at a time. It don't show them villains, said Pete. You can't tell yet, said Dick. There's something. But it's going all dark, said Pete. It's going dark all over. Nearly done. For a few moments longer, Dick worked the film to and fro in the developer. Then he picked it out, let it drip, and then just for half a second held it so that the faint red light from the lamp shone through it. It shows them, he cried. We've got them. Luckily, too, Dick didn't have to do any enlarging. 6:9 photo looks very small to us nowadays, but it was considered adequately large by most family photographers. I mean, I don't know about you, but I certainly have these little tiny photos of our grandparents sitting on a beach somewhere, usually fully clothed, sometimes in front of a very ancient motor car. So anyway, same size contact printing from the negative was all that was necessary, enabling Dick to produce the incriminating photograph, that small piece of shiny paper lying on Mr. Farland's blotting pad. One thing we can be fairly sure of is that Dick's camera was very like Ransome's own at the time of writing the book in 1940. Over the previous couple of years, he'd used it to meticulously record the building of Selina King, pasting the contact prints into a photo album, which, I may add, we subsequently enlarged for an exhibition, and they came up about that big, which shows the amount of detail that it was capable of capturing with such a film. Anyway, Ransome's publishers had advised him to avoid the war at all costs as a source of subject matter, and he no doubt agreed, having already recognised that a wartime plot would wreck the sense of a timeless fictional universe that he was creating. So even though the evidence of the war impinged on the Ransomes every day, the Big Six remained set safely in the autumn of 1932, 7 years earlier. Nevertheless, while I was rereading the book for this talk, this one exchange fairly leapt off the page at me. They'll have to emigrate, said Dorothea. What's that? Said Bill. It's what the Pilgrims did when they were persecuted. Persecution and emigration. Not 4 miles from Hoxted Hall, and indeed from Ransome's previous home at Levington, just across the waters Arthur had sailed in Nancy Blackett and conjured up in We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea, lies the Harwich Continental Ferry Terminal, which for most of 1939 had been the principal point of entry in the UK for the Kinder Transport programme. Some 10,000 Jewish children, many perhaps very like Dick and Dot in neat hats and coats with small suitcases, rescued from Nazi Germany, passed through it. It's something Ransome cannot have been unaware of, nor unaffected by, with his and Evgenia's experiences in the Russian Revolution. His evocation of the ease with which a community can be turned against some of its members undoubtedly had contemporary inspiration, and gives the book the dark edge that all detective stories inevitably have. Of course, in the end, everything turns out well. Dick's camera and his dark room do the job. There's a splendidly effective denouement scene in which Ransome ensures that it is the effect of the photograph rather than the photo itself that commands the attention. The Destined Glories are cleared, the true criminals get their comeuppance. So, what if anything happened after that? Well, it was not quite the end of the Broads books, or at any rate of the Destined Glories. Ransome decided to put Joe, Bill and Pete into another book, which would link them up with all of his other main characters in what was perhaps intended to be another grand finale. Joe, Bill and Pete stow away in a newly built motor cruiser on a lorry on Horning stays, which transports them to the Lake District, where they meet up with the Swallows, the Amazon, the Dees, Dick and Dot, in what is clearly intended to be a grand finale. Except that Ransome couldn't make it work. And after transporting his coots to the north, having the desired meeting take place and sketching some kind of an ending, he gave it up and turned his attention to Great Northern, which I'll come to in a moment. And Dick and Dot, on the other hand, meanwhile, went from strength to strength after the Big Six, appearing in 2 of Ransome's remaining 3 published books. The one they missed was Missy Lee, a sort of sequel to the fantasy metafictional Peter Duck, with the Swallows and the Amazons sailing the high seas aboard the Wildcat. The Dees get their starring role in The Picts and the Martyrs, in which they're forced to hide out in a semi-derelict hut to avoid the Amazons' dreaded great aunt, who has decided to visit their home, the Amazons' home, that is, Beckford. The story, which is essentially light social comedy after the style of Ransome's friend P.G. Wodehouse, is mostly told from the point of view of Dorothea. Now, I should say at this point that my view of the Dees' significance has changed over the years, and I now think of them as perhaps more significant characters than the Swallows and the Amazons. It's as if Ransome realised, once the first book began to turn into a series, that the original 6 characters wouldn't have the depth to sustain it. So he came up with 2 new ones to fill out the cast, and to an extent modelled them on himself. Dick is the geeky, science-minded boy that he was at that age. Dorothea is not exactly his storytelling alter ego. He has a lot of fun with her overripe but immature taste for melodrama in her novels, but she's also serious and perceptive and very protective towards her younger brother. My respect for Dorothea, and interest in her incidentally, went up a notch or 2 when I discovered quite recently that Dora Collingwood, one of the 2 daughters of the family whom the young Ransome had proposed to in his early 20s, and subsequently the mother of the original Swallows, had actually been christened Dorothy. So, of course, they appear in what was to turn out the real grand finale to the series, Great Northern, the one about a rare species of bird on a Hebridean island and the evil egg collector who wants to shoot them. Of course, Dick and his camera, there's finally a drawing of it in Great Northern, have a major role to play, and the book and the series end with Dick and Titty sitting in a boat in the lake with the contented birds nearby and their images captured by Dick on his camera. Dorothea's role in the tale is much more low-key. At least one commentator has put forward the theory that she is actually the unacknowledged narrator and author of the book. There's some internal support for this, with the style tending sometimes more to Dorothea's flights of fancy than Ransome's own plain tale approach. I like to think so at any rate.